Dr. Samuel Hartwell adjusted his glasses as he examined the sepia-toned photograph under the magnifying lens at his desk in the Harvard University archives. The image appeared to show 4 young women in their early 20s, dressed in the flowing white summer dresses typical of 1905, standing beneath a massive oak tree during what seemed to be a cheerful outdoor gathering. Their faces were bright with laughter, their postures relaxed and carefree in the manner of privileged young ladies enjoying a pleasant afternoon in the countryside. Yet something about the composition nagged at Samuel's expert eye, a subtle wrongness that 23 years of analyzing historical photographs had trained him to detect. The photograph had arrived as part of the Thornfield estate collection, donated by the descendants of a wealthy Boston family who had maintained extensive photographic records of their social activities during the early 1900s. According to the accompanying documentation, the image had been taken during a summer garden party at the family's country estate in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts, and it showed 4 close friends who had grown up together in Boston's elite social circles. The women were identified in flowing script on the back of the photograph as Miss Adelaide Thornfield, Miss Constance Whitmore, Miss Beatrice Ashford, and Miss Eleanor Crane. All 4 came from prominent Boston families and had been educated together at exclusive finishing schools before making their debuts in society during the 1903 and 1904 social seasons. According to family records, they had remained close friends throughout their young adult years, frequently visiting each other's country estates and participating in the elaborate social rituals that defined upper-class life during America's Gilded Age. Samuel had initially catalogued the photograph as a typical example of early 20th century leisure photography, the kind of carefully composed social documentation that wealthy families commissioned to record their refined way of life. However, his routine examination under magnification had revealed details that transformed his understanding of what the image actually depicted. The anomaly lay not in the 4 women themselves, who appeared exactly as one would expect young ladies of their social standing to appear during a summer gathering, but in the massive oak tree that dominated the background of the composition. The tree's shadow, which should have fallen naturally across the ground behind the women, according to the position of the sun, visible in the photograph, instead displayed what appeared to be the silhouette of additional figures that were not visible anywhere else in the image. When Samuel enhanced the shadow area using modern digital photography techniques, he could clearly distinguish the outlines of at least 3 human forms within the tree's shade. The figures appeared to be standing in positions that mirrored those of the 4 visible women, but their postures were somehow different, more rigid and formal than the relaxed poses of the photographed subjects. Most disturbing was the apparent presence of what looked like a 5th figure in the shadow, positioned slightly apart from the others and seeming to observe the group from a distance. This figure appeared larger and more distinctly formed than the others, with what seemed to be elaborate clothing or robes that created flowing patterns within the dark silhouette of the tree's shade. Samuel had encountered unusual photographic phenomena before in his work with historical images, including double exposures, chemical artifacts, and various forms of early photographic manipulation. However, the shadow anomaly in the 1905 photograph defied conventional explanation. The shadows appeared to have been cast by figures that were physically present during the photograph's exposure, yet these figures were completely invisible in the normally illuminated areas of the image. The technical aspects of the photograph suggested that it had been taken with a large format camera, using the standard techniques of the period, with no indication of experimental procedures or artistic manipulation. The exposure appeared uniform throughout the image, and the chemical processing showed no signs of deliberate alteration or composite work. Most significantly, the shadow figures showed proper perspective and lighting relationships that would be extremely difficult to achieve through deliberate manipulation using 1905 photographic technology. Samuel decided to research the background of the 4 women shown in the photograph, hoping to find some explanation for the mysterious shadow figures that might clarify what had occurred during the original photo session. His investigation into the Thornfield family archives revealed that Adelaide Thornfield had been an enthusiastic amateur photographer who had documented many aspects of her family's social life during the early 1900s. Adelaide's personal journals, preserved in the family collection, contained detailed accounts of the summer garden party where the photograph had been taken. According to her entries, the gathering had been planned as a celebration of Constance Whitmore's recent engagement to a prominent Boston businessman, and the four friends had specifically requested a commemorative photograph to mark the occasion. However, Adelaide's journal also contained references to unusual occurrences during the garden party that suggested the event had been less carefree than the photograph implied. She wrote about strange sounds coming from the wooded areas surrounding the estate, unexplained cold spots that made the guests uncomfortable, despite the warm summer weather, and what she described as an oppressive atmosphere that had gradually settled over the gathering as the afternoon progressed. Most significantly, Adelaide had recorded her observation that the massive oak tree under which they had posed for the photograph had seemed to create shadows that moved independently of the wind patterns affecting its branches. She noted that several guests had commented on this phenomenon, and that the photographer had seemed nervous about working in the area near the tree. Adelaide's description of the photographer provided additional context for understanding the mysterious aspects of the image. According to her account, the family had commissioned the services of a traveling photographer named Jeremiah Blackwood, who had gained a reputation throughout New England for his ability to capture what he advertised as the complete essence of social gatherings. Blackwood had arrived at the Thornfield estate with unusual equipment that differed from the standard photographic apparatus used by most society photographers of the period. Adelaide described elaborate arrangements of mirrors and reflective surfaces that Blackwood claimed would enhance the natural beauty of his subjects, and she noted that his preparation rituals for each photograph session were far more complex and time-consuming than anything she had previously experienced. Most intriguingly, Adelaide wrote that Blackwood had insisted on conducting what he called atmospheric preparation before taking any photographs, during which he would spend considerable time studying the light and shadow patterns in the chosen location. According to Adelaide's account, Blackwood had seemed particularly interested in the ancient oak tree and had made several cryptic comments about the accumulated impressions that old trees could hold from decades of human activity in their vicinity. Samuel's research into Jeremiah Blackwood's background revealed that the photographer had been known throughout New England during the early 1900s for his unconventional techniques and his claims of being able to capture supernatural phenomena in his images. Newspaper archives contain several articles about Blackwood's work, describing him as either a gifted artist who could reveal hidden aspects of his subjects, or as a charlatan who used elaborate showmanship to justify his unusually high fees. However, Samuel also discovered that Blackwood's career had ended abruptly in late 1905, shortly after the Thornfield garden party photograph had been taken. According to newspaper reports from the period, Blackwood had suffered what contemporary medical terminology described as a nervous breakdown, claiming that his photographic work had put him in contact with supernatural forces that he could no longer control. The photographer had apparently destroyed much of his equipment and negatives before entering a private sanitarium in western Massachusetts, where he had remained until his death in 1907. No explanation had ever been provided for Blackwood's sudden mental collapse, but several families who had commissioned his services reported experiencing unexplained phenomena in connection with the photographs he had taken. This background information suggested that the mysterious shadow figures in the 1905 photograph might be connected to Blackwood's unconventional photographic techniques and his apparent belief that cameras could capture supernatural phenomena that were invisible to normal perception. However, Samuel remained skeptical about supernatural explanations and continued searching for conventional reasons why human figures might appear only in shadow form within the image. His investigation led him to examine other photographs taken by Jeremiah Blackwood during his brief but productive career as a society photographer. Samuel contacted historical societies and private collectors throughout New England, seeking examples of Blackwood's work that might display similar anomalies to those he had observed in the Thornfield photograph. His search yielded several photographs that showed variations of the same phenomenon. In each case, Blackwood's images of social gatherings contained shadow patterns that seemed to include additional figures beyond those visible in the normally illuminated areas of the photographs. However, the shadow figures appeared to be different in each image, suggesting that they were not the result of consistent technical problems with Blackwood's equipment or methods. Most significantly, Samuel discovered that several of the families who had commissioned Blackwood's services had reported supernatural experiences following their photo sessions. These accounts described visitations from deceased relatives, unexplained sounds in their homes, and what several witnesses described as the sensation of being watched by unseen presences. The pattern of supernatural phenomena following Blackwood's photography sessions suggested that his techniques might have involved more than conventional artistic methods. However, Samuel recognized that these accounts had been recorded during a period when spiritualism and belief in supernatural phenomena were fashionable among wealthy Americans, and he remained cautious about accepting them as objective evidence of paranormal activity. Samuel decided to focus his investigation on the specific circumstances surrounding the 4 women who appeared in the 1905 Thornfield photograph. His research into their subsequent lives revealed patterns that suggested the photograph session might have had lasting consequences for all 4 participants. Adelaide Thornfield's journals, which continued through 1906, documented a gradual change in her personality and interests following the garden party photograph. She wrote increasingly about supernatural experiences, including visitations from deceased family members and prophetic dreams that seemed to come true with disturbing accuracy. Her family had become concerned enough about these claims to consult with physicians who had attributed her experiences to nervous exhaustion and recommended extended rest. However, Adelaide's condition had apparently deteriorated rather than improved, and by early 1907, her family had committed her to a private mental health facility where she had remained until her death in 1909. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, but family letters suggested that Adelaide had essentially wasted away from what appeared to be a combination of physical illness and profound psychological disturbance. Constance Whitmore's fate had been even more tragic. Her engagement, which had been celebrated at the garden party where the photograph was taken, had been broken off in late 1905 under circumstances that contemporary social records described as scandalous, but without providing specific details. Family correspondence suggested that Constance had begun exhibiting behaviors that her fiancé and his family found disturbing and inappropriate for a woman of her social standing. By 1906, Constance had become increasingly reclusive, avoiding social gatherings and spending most of her time in her family's country estate. Servants' accounts, preserved in household records, described her talking to unseen companions and claiming to receive messages from spirits who provided her with information about other people's private affairs. Her family had attempted to manage her condition privately, but Constance had died suddenly in 1907 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Beatrice Ashford had survived longer than her 2 friends, but her life had also taken a dark turn following the 1905 photograph session. She had married in 1906, but her husband had filed for divorce just 2 years later, citing what legal documents described as her involvement in occult practices and her claims of communicating with supernatural entities. The divorce had caused a major scandal in Boston society, effectively ending Beatrice's place in the social circles where she had once been prominent. Beatrice had spent her remaining years moving from city to city throughout New England, apparently supporting herself by offering services as a medium and fortune teller. She had gained a reputation in spiritualist circles for her apparently genuine psychic abilities, but she had also struggled with what contemporaries described as mental instability and episodes of violent behavior. Her death in 1912 had occurred during what witnesses described as a particularly intense séance session. Eleanor Crane had been the only one of the 4 friends to survive beyond 1912, but her life had also been profoundly affected by whatever had occurred during the 1905 photograph session. She had married and had children, maintaining a more conventional life than her 3 friends, but family records indicated that she had been plagued throughout her adult years by what she described as supernatural harassment. Eleanor's private papers, discovered among her descendants' possessions, contained detailed accounts of ongoing visitations from the spirits of her deceased friends. According to her writings, Adelaide, Constance, and Beatrice had continued to communicate with her after their deaths, providing her with information about events in the living world and making demands that she found increasingly difficult to fulfill. Most disturbing were Eleanor's descriptions of being compelled to participate in what she called spiritual photography sessions, during which she claimed her deceased friends would manifest visually enough to be captured on film. She had apparently commissioned several photographers to attempt documenting these manifestations, but the results had been inconsistent, and the photographers had typically refused to continue working with her after initial sessions. Eleanor's papers included several photographs that she claimed showed her deceased friends, but these images were of poor quality and showed only vague shapes that could be interpreted as human forms. However, the photographs did display shadow anomalies, similar to those Samuel had observed in the original 1905 Thornfield image, suggesting that Eleanor's later experiences might have been connected to whatever phenomenon had affected the original garden party photograph. The tragic fate of all 4 women who had appeared in Jeremiah Blackwood's 1905 photograph convinced Samuel that he was dealing with something far more serious than a simple photographic curiosity. The pattern of supernatural experiences, mental deterioration, and premature death that had affected all 4 women suggested that their participation in Blackwood's unusual photography session had exposed them to influences that had profoundly damaged their lives. However, Samuel also recognized that the supernatural interpretation of these events remained speculative, and that psychological and social factors might account for the women's difficulties without requiring paranormal explanations. The early 1900s had been a period of significant social change for women of the upper classes, and the pressure of conforming to rigid social expectations while dealing with limited opportunities for independent expression might have contributed to the mental health problems experienced by Adelaide, Constance, Beatrice, and Eleanor. Samuel decided to investigate Jeremiah Blackwood's background more thoroughly, hoping to understand the techniques the photographer had used and the possible mechanisms by which his work might have affected his subjects so profoundly. His research led him to contact the descendants of other families who had commissioned Blackwood's services, seeking additional perspectives on the photographer's methods and their consequences. His inquiries revealed that Blackwood's reputation had been based not only on his artistic skill, but also on his claims of being able to reveal hidden aspects of his subjects' personalities and circumstances. Several families reported that Blackwood's photographs had contained details or implications that had not been apparent during the original photo sessions, but that had subsequently proven to be accurate. These accounts suggested that Blackwood might have possessed genuine psychic abilities that allowed him to perceive information about his subjects that was not accessible through normal observation. However, Samuel also considered the possibility that Blackwood had been skilled at reading social cues and body language, allowing him to make accurate inferences about his subject's circumstances that he then incorporated into his photographic compositions. The mystery deepened when Samuel discovered a cache of Jeremiah Blackwood's personal papers that had been donated to a small historical society in the Berkshire Mountains. These documents, which had never been systematically studied, contained detailed notes about Blackwood's photographic techniques and his theories about the relationship between photography and supernatural phenomena. According to his notes, Blackwood believed that photographic emulsions could capture what he called spiritual impressions that were invisible to the human eye, but that represented the true essence of people and places. He had developed what he described as enhancement techniques that used mirrors and other reflective surfaces to concentrate and amplify these spiritual impressions, making them visible in the final photographs. Most significantly, Blackwood's papers revealed that he believed certain locations accumulated spiritual energy from decades or centuries of human activity, and that this accumulated energy could manifest visually in photographs taken under the right conditions. He had apparently spent considerable time researching the history of locations where he planned to work, seeking sites with what he called high spiritual resonance. Blackwood's notes about the Thornfield estate indicated that he had been particularly interested in the massive oak tree where the 1905 photograph had been taken. According to his research, the tree had been the site of significant events during the colonial period, including what historical records suggested might have been executions or other forms of violence. Blackwood believed that these traumatic events had left spiritual impressions that could be captured photographically under appropriate conditions. The photographer's theories provided a potential explanation for the shadow figures that Samuel had observed in the 1905 photograph, suggesting that they might represent spiritual impressions of people who had died at the site during earlier historical periods. However, Samuel remained skeptical about whether such phenomena could actually be captured through photographic means, even with the unusual techniques that Blackwood had apparently employed. Samuel's investigation took an unexpected turn when he was contacted by Dr. Maria Santos, a physicist at MIT who had been conducting research into what she described as anomalous photographic phenomena in historical images. Dr. Santos had heard about Samuel's work through professional networks and believed that her scientific analysis might provide insights into the mechanisms behind the unusual effects observed in Jeremiah Blackwood's photographs. Dr. Santos's examination of the 1905 Thornfield photograph, using advanced spectroscopic techniques, revealed several anomalies that could not be explained through conventional photographic science. The shadow areas that appeared to contain additional figures showed chemical compositions that differed significantly from the shadow areas that contained no anomalous forms, suggesting that different processes had been involved in creating these portions of the image. Most significantly, the shadow figures showed traces of silver compounds that were not consistent with the photographic emulsions used in 1905, indicating that additional materials had been incorporated into the image through unknown means. The distribution of these compounds followed patterns that corresponded exactly to the outline of the mysterious figures, ruling out the possibility that they represented random chemical contamination or deterioration. Dr. Santos's analysis also revealed that the photograph exhibited unusual electromagnetic properties, generating measurable energy fields in the areas where the shadow figures appeared. These energy signatures were consistent with what some researchers had observed in locations where unexplained phenomena had been reported, though the scientific community remained divided about the interpretation of such measurements. The physicist's findings provided scientific evidence that the 1905 photograph contained genuine anomalies that could not be explained through conventional understanding of photographic processes. However, the nature of these anomalies remained mysterious, and Dr. Santos acknowledged that her analysis raised more questions than it answered about how such effects might have been created. Samuel realized that his investigation had reached a point where academic research needed to acknowledge the possibility that some historical phenomena might lie beyond the boundaries of current scientific understanding. The combination of documentary evidence, scientific analysis, and consistent patterns across multiple cases suggested that Jeremiah Blackwood might have developed techniques that could genuinely capture supernatural phenomena, even if the mechanisms involved remained inexplicable. However, Samuel also recognized that the practical implications of this conclusion were troubling, particularly given the tragic fate that had befallen the 4 women who had participated in Blackwood's 1905 photography session. If the photographer's techniques had indeed exposed his subjects to supernatural influences, then his work represented not artistic innovation, but a dangerous practice that had caused significant harm to the people involved. The investigation had revealed that what initially appeared to be a simple photographic curiosity was actually evidence of a historical practice that had systematically exposed vulnerable individuals to psychological and possibly supernatural trauma. The 4 carefree young women in the 1905 photograph had been unknowing participants in an experimental process that had ultimately destroyed their lives. Samuel's final report on the Thornfield photograph case documented the scientific anomalies he had discovered, while acknowledging the limitations of current understanding in explaining how these effects had been created. He recommended that similar photographs from the same period be examined for comparable phenomena, and that researchers approach such materials with appropriate caution given their potential connection to harmful practices. The case had demonstrated that historical photographs could contain layers of meaning and evidence that were not immediately apparent to casual observation. The careful analysis of visual documents, combined with systematic research into the circumstances of their creation, could reveal important truths about past events that had been deliberately concealed or that had occurred beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. However, Samuel's investigation had also illustrated the ethical responsibilities that researchers faced when studying historical practices that might have caused harm to the people involved. The four women whose images had been preserved in the 1905 photograph deserve to be remembered not only as subjects of an unusual photographic experiment, but as individuals whose lives had been profoundly affected by their participation in activities they might not have fully understood. The shadow figures that had initially captured Samuel's attention remained mysterious, their identity and nature still subject to interpretation and debate. Whether they represented spiritual impressions of historical figures, manifestations of psychic phenomena, or some other form of anomalous occurrence, they served as a reminder that the past often contained complexities that challenged conventional frameworks of understanding. The massive oak tree that had dominated the 1905 photograph had been cut down decades earlier, during development of the Thornfield estate, taking with it whatever accumulated spiritual energy might have made the original photographic anomalies possible. However, the image itself remained as documentation of a brief moment when the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds had apparently become permeable through the experimental techniques of an ambitious photographer. Samuel's work had ensured that Adelaide Thornfield, Constance Whitmore, Beatrice Ashford, and Eleanor Crane would be remembered not only for their tragic fate, but also for their unwitting contribution to understanding the complex relationship between photography and phenomena that lay beyond normal human perception. Their story served as a cautionary tale about the risks of experimenting with forces that were not fully understood, and the responsibility of practitioners to consider the welfare of their subjects above their own artistic or commercial interests. The 1905 photograph continued to generate interest among researchers studying anomalous photographic phenomena, serving as a well-documented example of effects that challenged conventional scientific explanation. However, Samuel's investigation had also established important ethical guidelines for studying such materials, emphasizing the need to approach historical anomalies with respect for the human cost that might have been involved in their creation. The four friends who had posed so carefreely beneath the ancient oak tree in 1905 had become symbols of the vulnerability of individuals when they encountered practices that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Their smiling faces in the photograph served as a poignant reminder of how quickly lives could be altered by forces that seemed benign on the surface, but that carried hidden dangers for those who became involved with them. The case had profound implications for how historians and scientists approached the study of unusual phenomena from past eras, highlighting the need to balance scientific curiosity with ethical responsibility, and to remember that historical anomalies often involved real people whose lives had been affected by the events being studied. The shadow figures in the tree remained a mystery, but the human story they had helped reveal would continue to inform understanding of the complex relationships between innovation, experimentation, and the welfare of those who became subjects of historical practices that pushed the boundaries of accepted knowledge. However, Samuel's investigation was destined to take an even more dramatic turn when he received an unexpected contact from someone who claimed to possess additional evidence about the 1905 Thornfield photograph and the tragic fate of the four women who had posed beneath the ancient oak tree. The contact came from Mrs. Victoria Ashford Chen, a great-granddaughter of Beatrice Ashford, who lived in San Francisco and had spent decades researching her family's connection to what she described as the Blackwood curse. Victoria explained that her family had maintained extensive private records about Beatrice's experiences following the 1905 photograph session, including materials that had been deliberately concealed from public knowledge due to their disturbing content. According to Victoria, Beatrice had continued to document her supernatural encounters throughout her adult years, creating a detailed record of phenomena that had persisted long after Jeremiah Blackwood's death in 1907. Most significantly, Victoria claimed that Beatrice's papers contained evidence that the photographer's techniques had created permanent spiritual connections between his subjects and the supernatural entities that had appeared in his photographs. These connections had apparently remained active for decades, continuing to affect not only the original subjects, but also their descendants who had inherited what Beatrice described as spiritual obligations to the entities that Blackwood had captured on film. Samuel traveled to San Francisco to examine Victoria's family archives, hoping to find additional context for understanding the long-term consequences of Blackwood's experimental photography. What he discovered exceeded his expectations and transformed his understanding of the scope and persistence of the phenomena that had begun with the seemingly innocent garden party photograph in 1905. Beatrice Ashford's private journals, preserved by her family for over a century, provided a detailed chronicle of supernatural experiences that had continued throughout her adult life. According to her accounts, the shadow figures that had appeared in the 1905 photograph had not been passive impressions of deceased individuals, but active spiritual entities that had formed ongoing relationships with the four women who had posed for Blackwood's camera. Beatrice described these entities as possessing distinct personalities and agendas, and she claimed that they had continued to communicate with her and her three friends through various supernatural means following the original photograph session. Most disturbing was her assertion that the entities had begun making increasingly demanding requests of the four women, requiring them to participate in activities that became progressively more dangerous and socially destructive. According to Beatrice's journals, the supernatural harassment that had driven Adelaide to madness led to Constance's mysterious death, and caused Eleanor's lifelong torment had been orchestrated by the shadow entities as part of what Beatrice described as a systematic campaign to draw the four women into the spiritual realm. The entities apparently viewed their photographic capture as the beginning of a process that would ultimately result in the complete spiritual possession of Blackwood's subjects. Beatrice's accounts suggested that she had been the only one of the four friends to recognize the true nature of their situation and to attempt active resistance against the supernatural influences that were destroying their lives. Her involvement in occult practices and her work as a medium had apparently been motivated not by genuine interest in spiritualism, but by desperate attempts to understand and combat the entities that were systematically eliminating her and her friends. Most chilling were Beatrice's descriptions of what she called harvest ceremonies that the shadow entities had demanded of the four women. According to her accounts, the entities required periodic supernatural rituals during which they could temporarily manifest in physical form and interact directly with the living world. These ceremonies had apparently become increasingly elaborate and dangerous as the entities grew stronger through their ongoing connection to Blackwood's photograph. Beatrice wrote that Adelaide's commitment to a mental institution had followed her refusal to continue participating in these ceremonies, and that Constance's death had resulted from a ritual that had gone catastrophically wrong when the shadow entities had attempted to possess her completely. Eleanor's apparent survival had come at the cost of her agreement to continue serving the entities throughout her adult life, providing them with ongoing access to the physical world through her cooperation. Beatrice's own death in 1912 had apparently occurred during her final attempt to break the supernatural connections that Blackwood had created through his experimental photography. According to her journal entries, she had discovered a method for severing the spiritual bonds that tied her to the shadow entities, but the process had required her to sacrifice her own life to prevent the entities from claiming complete victory over all four friends. However, Beatrice's journals also contained disturbing evidence that her sacrifice had not been entirely successful in ending the supernatural threat. She wrote that the shadow entities possessed the ability to extend their influence beyond the original subjects of Blackwood's photographs, forming connections with the descendants of their primary targets and gradually expanding their reach across multiple generations. Victoria Ashford Chen's family had apparently been aware of this inherited supernatural burden for over a century, passing down knowledge and protective practices from generation to generation in an attempt to minimize the entity's influence over their lives. However, Victoria explained that these protective measures had become less effective over time, and that recent generations of her family had experienced increasingly intense supernatural harassment. Victoria's own experiences, which had begun during her childhood and had continued throughout her adult life, closely paralleled the phenomena that Beatrice had described in her journals from the early 1900s. Victoria reported regular visitations from entities that claimed to be the same shadow figures that had appeared in the 1905 photograph, and she described ongoing demands that she participate in supernatural activities that would strengthen their connection to the physical world. Most disturbing was Victoria's revelation that similar experiences were being reported by descendants of the other 3 women who had posed for Blackwood's camera. Through genealogical research and contact with other affected families, Victoria had discovered that the supernatural harassment was continuing to affect multiple family lines, suggesting that the entity's influence was spreading rather than diminishing over time. Samuel realized that his investigation had uncovered evidence of what amounted to a century-long supernatural epidemic that had originated with Jeremiah Blackwood's experimental photography and had gradually expanded to affect dozens of individuals across multiple generations. The 4 carefree young women in the 1905 photograph had become the inadvertent founders of family lines that were systematically being targeted by supernatural entities seeking to establish permanent connections with the living world. Victoria's archives included correspondence with other affected family members that documented similar experiences across different geographical locations and time periods. The letters described visitations, supernatural harassment, and demands for participation in increasingly dangerous ritual activities that echoed the patterns Beatrice had documented in her journals from over a century earlier. Most significantly, the correspondence revealed that the supernatural entities appeared to be working towards some form of collective goal that involved gathering enough spiritual energy from their human targets to achieve permanent manifestation in the physical world. The individual harassment experienced by family members was apparently part of a larger supernatural campaign that had been ongoing for over a century. Samuel found himself confronting evidence of a supernatural threat that had persisted far longer and affected far more people than anyone had realized. The 1905 photograph that had initially attracted his attention as an academic curiosity had led to the discovery of what amounted to an ongoing supernatural crisis that was continuing to cause harm to living individuals over a century after its origin. However, Samuel also recognized that the evidence he had gathered, while compelling within the context of his investigation, would be extremely difficult to present through conventional academic or scientific channels. The supernatural elements of the case challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality that were deeply embedded in institutional approaches to research and knowledge. Victoria Ashford Chen had contacted Samuel not only to share her family's archives, but also to request his assistance in finding a solution to the ongoing supernatural harassment that was affecting multiple family lines. She explained that traditional protective measures had become inadequate as the entities grew stronger over time, and that affected families were desperately seeking new approaches to breaking the spiritual connections that Blackwood had created through his experimental photography. Samuel's collaboration with Dr. Maria Santos had demonstrated that the 1905 photograph contained genuine scientific anomalies that could be measured and analyzed using modern technology. This suggested that the supernatural phenomena reported by affected families might also be susceptible to scientific investigation and potentially to technological intervention. Working with Dr. Santos and a team of specialists in electromagnetic phenomena, Samuel began developing experimental procedures designed to disrupt the energy patterns that seemed to be associated with the supernatural harassment experienced by Blackwood's descendants. The team hypothesized that if the original photographic process had created measurable electromagnetic signatures, it might be possible to neutralize these signatures using targeted technological intervention. The experimental procedures involved exposing the original 1905 photograph to carefully calibrated electromagnetic fields designed to disrupt the anomalous energy patterns that Dr. Santos had detected during her earlier analysis. The process required extensive safety precautions, as the team was uncertain about what effects might result from interfering with supernatural phenomena that had been active for over a century. The initial trials produced immediate and dramatic results. As the electromagnetic intervention proceeded, both Samuel and Dr. Santos reported sensing sudden changes in the atmospheric conditions around the photograph, including temperature fluctuations and the apparent presence of unseen entities that seemed to be reacting to the disruption of their connection to the physical world. Most significantly, Victoria Ashford Chen and other affected family members who were monitoring the experiment from remote locations reported simultaneous cessation of the supernatural harassment they had been experiencing. The visitations, supernatural sounds, and other phenomena that had plagued multiple family lines for over a century appeared to end abruptly as the electromagnetic intervention disrupted the spiritual connections that Blackwood had created through his experimental photography. However, the success of the technological intervention also produced unexpected complications. As the original spiritual connections were severed, the shadow entities that had been bound to the 1905 photograph appeared to seek alternative ways of maintaining their connection to the physical world. Several research team members reported experiencing intense supernatural harassment in the days following the experiment, suggesting that the entities were attempting to establish new relationships with individuals who had become involved in disrupting their original connections. The situation required additional intervention to protect the research team members and to ensure that the supernatural threat was permanently neutralized rather than simply transferred to new targets. Working with experts in traditional protective practices as well as cutting-edge electromagnetic technology, the team developed comprehensive procedures for severing all spiritual connections associated with Blackwood's experimental photography while protecting anyone who might become targeted during the process. The final intervention required the coordinated participation of affected family members from multiple locations, with each group performing synchronized activities designed to reject and banish the supernatural entities that had been harassing their families for over a century. The technological aspects of the procedure were combined with traditional protective rituals that had been developed by various affected families over the course of their long struggle with supernatural harassment. The comprehensive approach proved successful in permanently ending the supernatural phenomena that had originated with the 1905 photograph. Family members who had experienced lifelong supernatural harassment reported complete cessation of all unexplained phenomena, and subsequent monitoring confirmed that the electromagnetic anomalies associated with the original photograph had been permanently neutralized. However, the success of the intervention also raised profound questions about the nature of reality and the relationship between scientific and supernatural phenomena. The case had demonstrated that some forms of supernatural activity could be measured, analyzed, and ultimately neutralized using technological methods, suggesting that the boundaries between scientific and paranormal phenomena might be less absolute than commonly assumed. Samuel's final report on the expanded investigation documented not only the historical aspects of the case, but also the successful technological intervention that had ended over a century of supernatural harassment affecting multiple family lines. The report acknowledged the unusual nature of the phenomena involved while maintaining rigorous scientific standards in documenting the evidence and the methods used to address the supernatural threat. The case had demonstrated that historical research could sometimes uncover ongoing problems that required immediate intervention to protect living individuals from harm. The four friends who had posed so carefreely in the 1905 photograph had become the unwitting founders of family lines that had suffered from supernatural harassment for over a century, but their story had ultimately led to the development of new approaches for addressing similar phenomena. Samuel's work had succeeded in not only documenting the historical aspects of Jeremiah Blackwood's experimental photography, but also in developing practical solutions for protecting the descendants of his subjects from ongoing supernatural harm. The case illustrated the importance of approaching historical anomalies with both scholarly rigor and humanitarian concern for any individuals who might still be affected by the events being studied. The 1905 photograph itself had been permanently altered by the electromagnetic intervention, with the shadow figures that had once been visible in the tree's shade now completely absent from the image. However, the photograph remained valuable as documentation of a unique moment in history when experimental photography had inadvertently created connections between the physical and supernatural worlds that had persisted for over a century. Victoria Ashford Chen and other affected family members expressed profound gratitude for Samuel's willingness to approach their situation with both academic rigor and practical concern for their welfare. The case had demonstrated that historical research could serve not only the cause of expanding knowledge, but also the humanitarian goal of protecting living individuals from the ongoing consequences of past events. The successful resolution of the Blackwood case had implications that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the 1905 photograph and its supernatural consequences. The case had demonstrated that some historical phenomena remained active across multiple generations, and that traditional boundaries between past and present might be less absolute than commonly assumed. Samuel's experience had also illustrated the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to investigating unusual phenomena, showing how the combination of historical research, scientific analysis, and technological intervention could address problems that would be impossible to solve using any single methodology. The case had required expertise from multiple fields and the cooperation of individuals who might not normally work together. However, the case had also highlighted the ethical responsibilities that researchers faced when investigating phenomena that continued to affect living individuals. Samuel's initial academic interest in the 1905 photograph had evolved into a moral obligation to help resolve the ongoing supernatural crisis that his investigation had revealed, demonstrating that scholarly research sometimes required researchers to move beyond passive documentation toward active intervention. The four friends whose carefree pose beneath the ancient oak tree had initiated Samuel's investigation were finally at peace, their spiritual essence freed from the supernatural bonds that had trapped them and their descendants for over a century. Their story had served as a bridge between the historical past and the contemporary present, illustrating how events from over a century ago could continue to influence the lives of people in the modern world. The massive oak tree that had dominated the 1905 photograph was long gone, cut down decades earlier during development of the original estate. However, the spiritual energy that had accumulated around the tree over centuries of human activity had been successfully dissipated through the technological intervention, ensuring that the location could no longer serve as a focal point for supernatural manifestations. Samuel's investigation had transformed from an academic study of photographic anomalies into a comprehensive effort to understand and resolve a century-long supernatural crisis that had affected dozens of individuals across multiple generations. The case had demonstrated that historical research could serve humanitarian purposes while also contributing to expanding understanding of phenomena that challenged conventional frameworks of knowledge. The shadow figures that had once haunted the descendants of Blackwood's photographic subjects were gone, their spiritual energy dissipated through the electromagnetic intervention that had severed their connections to the physical world. However, the knowledge gained from studying their manifestations and developing methods for neutralizing their influence would continue to inform approaches to similar phenomena that might be encountered in the future. Samuel's work had established important precedents for handling historical artifacts that displayed supernatural properties, emphasizing the need to balance scholarly investigation with concern for the welfare of anyone who might be affected by such phenomena. The case had shown that some historical mysteries required not only academic analysis, but also practical intervention to protect living individuals from ongoing harm. The four women whose images had been preserved in the 1905 photograph had finally found the peace that had been denied to them during their tragically shortened lives. Their story had served as a catalyst for developing new understanding of the relationship between photography and supernatural phenomena, while also demonstrating the persistence of spiritual connections across multiple generations. Samuel's comprehensive investigation had succeeded in solving one of the most complex and long-lasting supernatural mysteries in American history, while also protecting numerous individuals from continued harassment by entities that should have been laid to rest over a century earlier. The case stood as a testament to the power of rigorous research, combined with humanitarian concern, to address problems that spanned the boundaries between past and present, between the scientific and the supernatural, and between academic knowledge and practical intervention. However, the resolution of the Blackwood case had unexpected consequences that would challenge Samuel's understanding of the scope and persistence of supernatural phenomena in ways he had never anticipated. 3 months after the successful electromagnetic intervention that had apparently neutralized the shadow entities from the 1905 photograph, Samuel began receiving reports from other researchers and institutions about similar photographic anomalies being discovered in archives throughout New England. The reports described photographs from the same general time period that displayed shadow figures, electromagnetic anomalies, and connections to families who had experienced supernatural harassment across multiple generations. The pattern suggested that Jeremiah Blackwood had not been the only photographer experimenting with techniques designed to capture supernatural phenomena, and that what Samuel had initially believed to be an isolated case might actually be one example of a much larger network of experimental practices. Dr. Angela Morrison, curator of photographic collections at the Boston Public Library, contacted Samuel to report the discovery of at least 7 photographs in their archives that displayed shadow anomalies similar to those he had documented in the Thornfield image. These photographs had been taken by different photographers working throughout Massachusetts between 1903 and 1908, but they shared technical characteristics and supernatural consequences that closely paralleled the Blackwood case. Most disturbing was Dr. Morrison's revelation that her investigation had identified what appeared to be a formal organization of photographers who had been sharing techniques for capturing supernatural phenomena during the early 1900s. This organization, which had called itself the Ethereal Photography Society, had apparently maintained detailed records of their experimental procedures and had systematically documented the supernatural effects produced by their work. The Society's archives, discovered in the basement of a Boston photography studio that had been sold repeatedly over the decades, contained extensive correspondence between members who discussed methods for enhancing spiritual sensitivity in photographic emulsions and techniques for concentrating supernatural energy in specific locations. The documents revealed that the photographers had been working with spiritualist mediums and occult practitioners to develop procedures that deliberately created connections between the living and the dead through photographic processes. Samuel realized that his investigation of the 1905 Thornfield photograph had uncovered evidence of what amounted to a coordinated supernatural experiment that had been conducted across New England during the early 1900s. The tragic fate of Adelaide, Constance, Beatrice, and Eleanor had been part of a systematic campaign to document and manipulate supernatural phenomena using the emerging technology of photography. The Ethereal Photography Society's records indicated that the organization had been founded in 1902 by a group of photographers who had been influenced by the spiritualist movement and who believed that camera technology could be used to prove the existence of life after death. However, the Society's activities had gradually evolved beyond simple documentation toward active manipulation of supernatural forces, with members competing to create increasingly dramatic and powerful spiritual manifestations. The Society's correspondence revealed that Jeremiah Blackwood had been considered one of their most successful practitioners, known for his ability to create photographs that produced long-lasting supernatural effects on their subjects. However, the documents also indicated that several other members had achieved similar results using slightly different techniques, suggesting that the knowledge and capabilities that Blackwood had demonstrated were not unique to him alone. Most significantly, the archives contained evidence that the Society had maintained detailed records of the supernatural consequences experienced by their subjects, treating the psychological and spiritual damage caused by their experiments as valuable data for refining their techniques, rather than as ethical concerns requiring their intervention. The organization had apparently viewed the people who posed for their photographs as experimental subjects rather than clients deserving of protection and care. Samuel's collaboration with Dr. Morrison expanded to include researchers from multiple institutions who were investigating similar discoveries in their own collections. The network of investigators gradually revealed the full scope of the Ethereal Photography Society's activities, documenting systematic supernatural experimentation that had affected hundreds of individuals across New England during the early 1900s. The investigation revealed that the Society had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating spiritual connections through photography, including techniques for binding multiple entities to single images and procedures for creating what they called spiritual networks that connected subjects across different photographs and locations. These advanced techniques had apparently produced supernatural effects that were more persistent and far-reaching than anything achieved by individual practitioners working in isolation. However, the archives also contained evidence that the Society's experiments had eventually spiraled beyond their control, with supernatural entities becoming increasingly powerful and demanding as the photographers pushed the boundaries of their techniques. Several documents described incidents where Society members had been killed or driven insane by the entities they had attempted to manipulate, and the organization appeared to have dissolved abruptly in 1908, following a series of catastrophic failures. The dissolution of the Ethereal Photography Society had apparently left dozens of supernatural situations unresolved, with affected families continuing to experience harassment from entities that had been summoned through photographic processes but never properly contained or banished. The descendants of these families had spent over a century dealing with supernatural problems that originated from experiments they had never fully understood. Samuel's expanded investigation identified at least 43 families throughout New England who had been affected by the Society's activities, many of whom had developed their own protective practices and coping mechanisms without ever understanding the true origin of their supernatural difficulties. The electromagnetic intervention techniques that had proven successful in resolving the Blackwood case needed to be adapted and scaled to address the much larger scope of the Society's legacy. Working with a team that included Dr. Santos, Dr. Morrison, and specialists from multiple institutions, Samuel began developing comprehensive procedures for identifying and neutralizing the supernatural connections that had been created through the Ethereal Photography Society's experiments. The project required extensive coordination between affected families, advanced electromagnetic technology, and traditional protective practices from various spiritual traditions. The scale of the intervention required careful planning and coordination to ensure that the simultaneous disruption of multiple supernatural networks would not create dangerous instabilities or unexpected interactions between different spiritual systems. The team developed protocols for gradually reducing the power of the supernatural connections while monitoring for any adverse effects on the families who had been living with these influences for over a century. The comprehensive intervention was conducted over a period of 6 months, with different supernatural networks being addressed in carefully planned sequence to minimize the risk of dangerous interactions between the various spiritual systems that had been created by the Society's experiments. Each phase of the intervention required the participation of multiple affected families and careful monitoring of electromagnetic effects across large geographical areas. The success of the expanded intervention exceeded the team's expectations, with families throughout New England reporting the cessation of supernatural phenomena that had affected their bloodlines for over a century. However, the project also revealed the true scope of the damage that had been caused by the Ethereal Photography Society's irresponsible experimentation, with some families reporting that they had lost multiple generations to supernatural harassment and related psychological trauma. The resolution of the Society's legacy required not only technological intervention, but also extensive support for families who had been affected by decades of supernatural abuse. Many affected individuals required counseling and support to adjust to normal life after lifetimes of dealing with supernatural harassment, and some families needed assistance in understanding the true history of their experiences and the systematic nature of the exploitation they had endured. Samuel's work on the expanded project established new protocols for handling historical artifacts that displayed supernatural properties and for investigating organized supernatural activity from past eras. The case demonstrated that some historical phenomena required coordinated intervention on a scale that exceeded what individual researchers or institutions could accomplish alone. The project also highlighted the importance of systematic documentation and preservation of evidence related to supernatural phenomena, showing how careful archival work could reveal patterns and connections that would otherwise remain hidden. The Ethereal Photography Society's records had provided crucial insights into the methods and motivations behind their experiments, enabling modern researchers to develop effective countermeasures. However, the expanded investigation also raised disturbing questions about the possibility that similar organized supernatural experiments might have been conducted in other regions or time periods, potentially leaving additional legacies of supernatural harm that remained unidentified and unresolved. Samuel's team began working with researchers in other parts of the United States and internationally to identify and investigate similar patterns of historical supernatural experimentation. The four friends whose carefree pose in the 1905 photograph had initiated Samuel's investigation had become symbols of all the individuals who had been victimized by the Ethereal Photography Society's systematic abuse of experimental subjects. Their story had served as the key that unlocked understanding of a much larger pattern of historical exploitation and had led to the development of methods for protecting the descendants of the society's victims. The ancient oak tree that had dominated the original photograph was gone, but its spiritual significance had been permanently neutralized along with the supernatural networks that had used it as a focal point for over a century. The location where the tree had stood was now just ordinary ground, freed from the accumulated spiritual energy that had made it dangerous to anyone with psychic sensitivity. Samuel's investigation had evolved from academic curiosity about photographic anomalies into a comprehensive humanitarian project that had protected hundreds of individuals from ongoing supernatural harm, while also contributing to new understanding of the relationship between technology and spiritual phenomena. The case had demonstrated that historical research could serve both scholarly and humanitarian purposes when approached with appropriate concern for the welfare of living individuals. The electromagnetic techniques that had proven successful in neutralizing supernatural connections had potential applications beyond addressing historical supernatural problems, offering new approaches for investigating and potentially resolving contemporary paranormal phenomena. The combination of scientific analysis and traditional protective practices had proven more effective than either approach would have been alone. Samuel's final comprehensive report on the Ethereal Photography Society case documented not only the historical aspects of the organized supernatural experimentation, but also the successful development and implementation of technological solutions for protecting the descendants of the society's victims. The report established important precedents for handling large-scale supernatural phenomena that had persisted across multiple generations. The case had profound implications for understanding the relationship between technological innovation and spiritual phenomena, demonstrating that advances in photography during the early 1900s had created unprecedented opportunities for supernatural manipulation that had not been adequately understood or controlled by the practitioners who developed them. The Society's experiments had shown both the potential and the dangers of applying emerging technologies to spiritual practices without appropriate ethical safeguards. The successful resolution of the Society's century-long legacy had required the cooperation of researchers from multiple disciplines, affected families from across New England, and specialists in both cutting-edge technology and traditional spiritual practices. The project had demonstrated the importance of collaborative approaches to addressing complex phenomena that transcended the boundaries of individual areas of expertise. Samuel's work had ensured that the Ethereal Photography Society's victims, including the four friends from the 1905 photograph, would be remembered not only for the suffering they had endured, but also for their contribution to developing new understanding of supernatural phenomena and new methods for protecting future generations from similar exploitation. Their legacy had been transformed from one of victimization to one of protection and knowledge. The shadow figures that had once haunted the descendants of the Society's photographic subjects were finally at rest, their spiritual energy properly released from the artificial bonds that had trapped them in the physical world for over a century. However, the knowledge gained from studying their manifestations and developing methods for neutralizing their influence would continue to inform efforts to identify and resolve similar phenomena wherever they might be discovered. The comprehensive investigation had revealed that some aspects of American history contained organized supernatural activities that had been deliberately concealed from public knowledge, but that had continued to affect living individuals across multiple generations. The case had shown that historical research could sometimes uncover ongoing problems that required immediate intervention rather than simple documentation. Samuel's experience had illustrated the complex ethical responsibilities that researchers faced when investigating phenomena that continued to affect living people, showing how academic investigation could evolve into humanitarian intervention when the welfare of contemporary individuals was at stake. The case had established important precedents for balancing scholarly inquiry with moral obligation to protect vulnerable populations. The four women whose innocent summer gathering had been transformed into a supernatural trap had finally found the peace that had been denied to them during their tragically shortened lives. Their images, preserved in the 1905 photograph that had initiated Samuel's investigation, now served as a memorial to all the individuals who had been victimized by unethical supernatural experimentation and as a reminder of the importance of protecting future generations from similar exploitation. The Ethereal Photography Society's archives had been permanently sealed and placed under the protection of institutions with expertise in handling potentially dangerous supernatural artifacts, ensuring that the organization's techniques could not be misused by future practitioners while still preserving the historical record of their activities for legitimate research purposes. The case had shown that some knowledge required careful safeguarding rather than open dissemination. Samuel's investigation had transformed from a simple academic project into one of the most significant supernatural interventions in American history, protecting hundreds of individuals from ongoing harm